Listen, there's a moment in 1807 that I want you to really think about. John Colter is standing at the Mandan villages with Lewis and Clark. Behind him is the journey home. 2 years of wages waiting. A farm, a wife, civilization with all its comfortable promises. And ahead, mountains so massive the Crow people called them the backbone of the world. The shining mountains. Now, Colter had just spent 2 years crossing a continent. He'd seen things that would make modern explorers weep with envy. And he turns to Meriwether Lewis and says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Thanks, but I'm going back. Back into the wilderness. Into country where grizzly bears stood 9 feet tall and Blackfoot warriors considered white men the best sport available. Where winters froze the spit in your mouth before it hit the ground. Why? Because beaver pelts were bringing $3,000 a year to men who knew how to survive out there. $3,000 when a factory worker in Philadelphia or New York was pulling down maybe 300 annually. That's 10 times the money. If you lived, which most men didn't. The thing that gets me about this moment is how calculated it actually was. We like to think of these mountain men as wild romantics, throwing themselves at adventure. But Colter knew exactly what he was doing. He'd learned from Sacagawea and other native guides that there were ways to survive out there. Networks, alliances. The Crow and Shoshone weren't hostile to trade. They were eager for it. They wanted guns, metal tools, things the Americans had. And the Americans wanted beaver pelts that were worth actual fortunes in London and Paris and New York. So in 1807, Manuel Lisa starts pushing his keelboats up the Missouri with 60 men and dreams bigger than the territory itself. Among these 60 are John Colter, a famous from Lewis and Clark, a famous George Drouillard, and a young kid named Jim Bridger, who can't read. All right, but who will live long enough to watch everything they're about to build burn to the ground? That's the thing about this story that haunts me. Some of these men survived long enough to become the destroyers of their own paradise. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Crow and Shoshone see these boats coming, and they understand something crucial. These strange pale men with their insatiable hunger for beaver, they represent opportunity on multiple levels. Trade goods, yes. Metal knives and guns that change the balance of power on the plains, but also potential allies against their enemies. The Blackfoot to the north were making life dangerous for everyone. Native women had already figured out that marriage to these trappers could bind the worlds together, create children who belonged to both cultures, give their tribes advantages in trading. Sacagawea had already proven this model worked. It wasn't romance. It was strategy that happened to sometimes involve actual affection. By 1810, John Colter has become something beyond a trapper. He's become a legend in his own time. He'd outrun Blackfoot warriors, and when I say outrun, I mean he ran naked through what would become Yellowstone National Park with his feet literally shredded to ribbons, leaving blood trails, while 300 Blackfoot tried to catch him. He survived. Barely. And in the process, he saw things that sound like fever dreams. Geysers shooting water hundreds of feet into the air. What the Crow called water that shoots at the stars. Sulphur springs bubbling up from the earth like Satan's bathtub. When Colter got back to civilization and told people what he'd seen, they laughed at him, called it Colter's hell, and assumed he'd lost his mind. He hadn't lost his mind. He'd just seen Yellowstone before anyone was ready to believe it existed. Meanwhile, Andrew Henry is building the first American fort west of the Continental Divide. Think about the audacity of that. Putting down permanent American roots in territory that doesn't belong to America, that native peoples have occupied for centuries, that the British and Spanish also have claims on. But Henry does it because the beaver are there. Because the beaver are everywhere out there in numbers that defy description. And back in New York City, John Jacob Astor is calculating profits with the precision of a banker multiplying his money. He's watching London fashion trends where beaver felt hats are the height of sophistication. He's watching Chinese demand for furs climb through the ceiling. And he's doing the math. Beaver pelts are literally worth their weight in silver, sometimes more. Now, here's what makes this era so fascinating. This isn't a story about lone wolves conquering wilderness. That's the myth we tell ourselves later. The reality is so much more complex and interesting. These trappers succeed because they integrate themselves into existing native societies. They learn languages. They learn survival techniques that white civilization has forgotten or never knew. They marry native women not as captives or temporary arrangements, but as actual wives who teach them how to read weather, where to find food in winter, how to cure buckskin, which plants heal and which kill. The economic calculation driving everything is almost obscene by modern standards. A good trapper could pull 60 beaver pelts out of a stream in a season. That's $600. Do that 5 times in different locations. $3,000 in a year when that kind of money could buy you a farm, equipment, livestock, and have enough left over to live like a king for years. But, and this is the critical but, you had to survive. Grizzly bears that could disembowel you with one swipe. Blackfoot and Arikara warriors who viewed you as invaders worth killing. Winters where the temperature dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for months. Where exposed skin froze in minutes. Where men who fell through ice simply died before anyone could save them. William Ashley figures out you can advertise for this. In 1822, he places a newspaper ad that's basically a death warrant wrapped in economic opportunity. Enterprising young men to ascend the Missouri River to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. Enterprising. That's the word that gets me. Not experienced, not trained. Enterprising. Which is another way of saying willing to risk everything for money and freedom. 100 men answer that ad. Among them is 18-year-old Jim Bridger, who can't even read the ad but hears about it through the grapevine and knows this is his chance. Jedediah Smith shows up with a Bible and a rifle he calls York, determined to find God and beaver in equal measure. And there's Hugh Glass, who's already lived with the Pawnee, who's already survived things most men couldn't imagine, bringing skills and a personality that's about to make him the most famous mountain man who ever lived. The thing you have to understand is these men are running towards something as much as they're running from something. Running from civilization's constraints? Yes. From poverty, from social hierarchies, from futures as factory workers or farm laborers. But running toward a freedom so absolute it borders on terrifying. The freedom to live or die by your own choices, to be judged by your skills and courage rather than your birth or education, to reinvent yourself completely. Jim Bridger could become whatever he was capable of becoming out there. The illiterate kid could become a legend. And he did. So by 1822, the pattern is set. Mountain men are flooding into territory that the maps still show as blank space. They're traveling in small groups or alone, covering thousands of miles, learning from native peoples who know this country in their bones. And they're sending beaver pelts back east, in quantities that make investors salivate. The era we're about to enter, from roughly 1820 through 1840, will see 3,000 men create an empire in the mountains. An empire built on animal pelts and male courage and native knowledge and marriages that span cultures. But before we get to the Golden Age, we need to understand what it costs. And in 1823, Hugh Glass is about to pay a price that makes every other story sound tame. A grizzly bear sow with cubs is about to teach the mountain men that no matter how tough they think they are, nature is tougher. And what Glass does next will become the defining story of mountain man resilience. The kind of story that sounds like a lie but isn't. The kind that makes you realize these men operated on a level of toughness we can barely comprehend today. This is where paradise starts calling them home, and some of them, many of them, will never leave. William Ashley's advertisement changes everything, but not in the way anyone expects. The 100 men who answer his call in 1822 aren't an army. They're barely an organization. What they are is a collection of misfits, fugitives, adventurers, and desperate men willing to bet their lives against $3,000 a year. Among them, 18-year-old Jim Bridger stands out mainly for how much he doesn't stand out. He's illiterate, poor, and has exactly zero experience in the mountains. What he does have is the kind of adaptability that turns farm boys into legends. Jedediah Smith brings something different to the party. He's got education, religious conviction, and a York rifle he trusts like a brother. Smith wants to map the West for God and country while making money doing it. There's an idealism to Smith that sets him apart. He's not running from civilization, he's trying to expand it. And then there's Hugh Glass. Glass has already lived with the Pawnee. He speaks their language, understands their customs, and carries skills that most white men will spend years trying to learn. If Smith is the idealist and Bridger is the blank slate, Glass is the man who's already been forged by frontier life and come out harder than anyone expected. The Arikara attack of 1823 should have ended the whole enterprise right there. 15 of Ashley's men dead on a sandbar, their bodies mutilated, their scalps decorating Arikara lodges, while the survivors huddle in keelboats wondering what the hell they've gotten themselves into. It's a massacre, a disaster, the kind of catastrophe that should send everyone running back to civilization. But here's the thing that defines these men. They don't run. They adapt. They learn. They stop traveling in large groups that attract attention and start moving in small parties of 3 to 5 men. They marry into tribes, and I want to be clear about what this means. These aren't the temporary arrangements of French voyageurs taking country wives they'll abandon when they go back to Montreal. These are real marriages. Jim Bridger will take 3 native wives over his lifetime. Each one teaches him languages, customs, geography, survival techniques that no white man could learn alone. The women aren't passive participants here. They're gaining protection for themselves and trade advantages for their tribes. They're creating kinship networks that span thousands of miles. When a Flathead woman marries a mountain man, her entire tribe gains a trading partner. Her brothers gain an ally in war. Her children will speak English and Flathead and move between both worlds. This is creating an entirely new culture, a fusion culture. Mountain men start thinking like their native wives. They learn to read weather in the flight of ravens and the behavior of animals. They learn which herbs prevent scurvy, how to cure buckskin so it stays soft in freezing temperatures, how to navigate by stars that native peoples have mapped into stories. The exchange flows both ways. Native. Peoples get metal tools that make their lives easier. Steel knives and axes that don't break like stone tools. And guns. Always guns. The gun changes everything on the plains. A tribe with guns has power over tribes without them. Mountain men become valuable not just for trade goods but as potential allies in the endless wars between native nations. Then comes September 1823. Hugh Glass is near the Grand River, probably checking his trap lines, when a grizzly sow with cubs catches him alone. Now, I want you to really imagine this. You're Hugh Glass. You're experienced, armed, careful, and suddenly there's an 800-pound grizzly bear on top of you moving faster than seems possible for something that size. She tears his scalp loose from his skull, rips his throat open so his windpipe is visible, breaks his leg, decorates his back with claw marks so deep his ribs are exposed. Glass manages to kill her, barely, but he's dying, obviously dying. His companions can see that. They can see bone and organs and blood everywhere. 2 men volunteer to stay with Glass until he dies and give him a proper burial, e.g. 1, young Jim Bridger and John Fitzgerald. They wait. 1 day, 2 days. Glass keeps breathing somehow, And here's where it gets interesting from a human psychology standpoint. They're in Arikara country, hostile territory. Every hour they wait is an hour they might get killed themselves. Glass is unconscious, torn apart, obviously not going to make it. So Bridger and Fitzgerald make a decision that will haunt at least one of them forever. They take Glass's rifle and knife, expensive equipment, too valuable to bury, and they leave. They tell the others, Glass died. They probably believe it themselves. Hugh Glass wakes up alone, miles from any fort, without weapons or supplies, his body destroyed, and he starts crawling. 200 miles to Fort Kiowa. Let that sink in. 200 miles, crawling. His throat is so damaged he can't speak or eat. Solid food. He survives on berries, roots, and at one point, maggots eating the dead flesh in his wounds, which actually helps prevent infection. He kills a rattlesnake and eats it raw. When wolves take down a buffalo calf, he drives them off and feasts on the meat for days, letting it start to rot because he can't carry it with him. The crawl takes 6 weeks. 6 weeks of agony that should have killed him 100 times over. But Glass is driven by something stronger than pain, avenge. He's going to find Bridger and Fitzgerald and make them pay for leaving him to die like an animal. When he finally drags himself into Fort Kiowa, the men there think they're seeing a ghost. Glass had been reported dead. Here he is, barely alive but alive, held together by rage and willpower that defies medical explanation. The revenge part of the story is what really gets me, though. Glass spends months recovering and tracking down the men who abandoned him. He finds Fitzgerald first, but Fitzgerald has joined the army, and Glass can't touch him without hanging for killing a soldier. Then he finds Jim Bridger, young Jim Bridger, who's maybe 19 years old now, terrified, expecting death, and Glass looks at this kid and sees what? A frightened boy who made a bad decision in a bad situation. Glass forgives him, just like that. The revenge he's crawled 200 miles for evaporates when he's actually face to face with the reality of it. Bridger is just trying to survive, same as everyone. The rage that kept Glass alive becomes pointless when confronted with actual humanity. This story spreads through the mountains like wildfire. The man who wouldn't die, the crawl that shouldn't have been possible. It establishes something about mountain men that becomes part of their identity, where they can endure anything. Physical damage that would kill normal men just slows them down. It's not entirely true, of course. Plenty of mountain men die from injuries, disease, exposure. But the legend of Hugh Glass becomes a measuring stick. If Glass could do that, maybe you can survive your own impossible situation. The first rendezvous happens in 1825 on Henry's Fork of the Green River, and it's genius from a business perspective. Instead of mountain men having to travel all the way back to Street, Louis to sell their furs and buy supplies, William Ashley brings the supplies to them. One location, one time per year, usually in July. Mountain men come out of the wilderness with their year's catch. Native tribes bring their furs and families. Traders bring everything from gunpowder to sugar to whiskey to fabric. For 2 or 3 weeks, thousands of people gather in one spot and the trading begins. But it's not just business. The rendezvous becomes a cultural explosion. Men who've been alone or in tiny groups for months go absolutely wild. There's gambling, fighting, horse racing, shooting contests. Mountain men bet entire year's earnings on a single card game and lose it with a shrug. There are marriages, formal and informal, native women evaluating which trappers look like good bets for husbands, trappers showing off scars and telling stories that get more exaggerated with each retelling. There's drinking on a scale that makes modern binge drinking look tame. A year's worth of danger and loneliness exploding into weeks of chaos. And the marriages that happen here matter. They're not just about individual men and women. They're political alliances, economic partnerships, cultural exchanges. When Jim Bridger marries a Flathead woman, he's not just getting a wife. He's getting a teacher, a translator, a diplomatic connection to her entire tribe. The Flathead get a permanent trading relationship with one of the most successful trappers in the mountains. Their children will speak English and Flathead, will understand both cultures, will be able to move between worlds in ways neither parent can alone. The economics of the rendezvous are insane. A trapper might bring in $600 worth of beaver pelts. By the time he leaves, he's often broke or in debt, because a pint of whiskey costs $5, 15 times what it costs in Street Louis. Sugar is $2 a pint when it's 25 cents back east. Everything is marked up 8 to 10 times normal prices. But the trappers pay it because what else are they going to do with money in the middle of the mountains? They can't take it with them. So they spend it all, gear up, and head back into the wilderness for another year of solitary danger. The system works brilliantly for the fur companies. They're making money on both ends, buying furs cheap and selling supplies expensive. The trappers are making less than they think, spending more than they should, and staying perpetually in debt to the companies. It's not quite indentured servitude, but it's close. The freedom these men have come to the mountains for is real in terms of how they live day to day, but economically they're trapped in a cycle that keeps them working year after year. By 1827, the system is fully established. 300 mountain men spread across territory, from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, from Canada to Mexico. They're mapping routes that will become the Oregon Trail, the California Trail. They're learning native languages and customs. They're having children who belong to both cultures and neither. They're creating trails through mountain passes, marking water sources, establishing relationships with dozens of different tribes. And they're pulling beaver out of streams at a rate that seems sustainable because the country is so vast. There are so many beaver. How could they possibly trap them all? Jim Bridger is 23 years old in 1827 and already legendary. He's been in fights with Blackfoot warriors and won. He's survived winters that killed grown men. He's learned to speak Flathead Shoshone and enough Crow to trade and socialize. When Bridger tells you something about geography or weather or animal behavior, you listen, because the kid who couldn't read has become one of the best mountain men alive through pure observation and adaptation. He's going to live another 54 years and watch everything he's helping build crumble into dust. But right now, in 1827, he's young and strong and living in paradise with a freedom that kings can't buy, and paradise has never looked better. The beaver are thick. The mountain men are learning to survive winter after winter. The rendezvous keeps getting bigger. Native alliances are holding. For a brief moment, maybe 5 years, maybe 10, it actually works. The dream of living free in the mountains, making money, having adventures, seems achievable, sustainable even. But already, there are signs if you know where to look. Streams that used to produce 100 beaver pelts now produce 70. Areas that were virgin territory 5 years ago are getting trapped out. And back east, fashion is starting to change in ways that will eventually destroy everything these men have built. But that's coming later. Right now, Blood Brothers and Beaver Kings rule an empire in the mountains, and it feels like it might last forever. The years from 1826 through 1834 represent the absolute peak of mountain man culture. 3,000 men ruling an empire larger than Western Europe. Think about that scale for a second. 3,000 men in territory that stretches from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast, from the Canadian Rockies down to New Mexico. They're not controlling it in any governmental sense. There are no laws, no courts, no police. They're controlling it through knowledge, relationships, and the willingness to use violence when necessary. And the beaver are still thick enough that men can make real fortunes if they're good enough and lucky enough. Jim Bridger tastes the Great Salt Lake in 1825 and spits it out, genuinely believing he's reached the Pacific Ocean. I love this story because it shows how vast the unknown still is. Bridger is one of the best mountain men alive, and he doesn't know the Great Salt Lake exists until he's literally swimming in it. He reports back that he's found salt water, the ocean, and it takes months before anyone realizes he's discovered a massive inland sea that nobody in the American consciousness knew was there. The geography of the West is still mostly guesswork, and native knowledge being slowly decoded by white explorers. Jedediah Smith pulls off something that sounds completely insane in 1826 and 1827. He crosses the Mojave Desert in summer, losing men to thirst and heat, his own lips swelling black, his tongue too large for his mouth. At one point, his men are drinking their own urine trying to stay alive. Why is he doing this? He's trying to prove you can reach California overland, that there's a viable route for American trade and settlement. And he succeeds. Barely. But he makes it, proving that California, Mexican California, at this point, can be reached without sailing around Cape Horn or crossing Panama. Smith's achievement is enormous from a geographical standpoint, but it's also tragic in a way he doesn't fully understand. He's opening California to American conquest. Within 20 years, the territory he's mapping will be American territory, taken from Mexico by force. The trails he's blazing will carry emigrants who will transform California from remote Mexican province to American state. Smith is driven by curiosity and faith, genuinely believes he's doing God's work, expanding Christian civilization, but he's actually working as an advanced scout for empire. Joe Walker finds the Yosemite Valley in 1833, and here's where I want you to imagine being in his boots. You're traveling through the Sierra Nevada, mountains so massive they make the Rockies look modest. You're following native trails through granite wilderness, and suddenly you round a cliff face, and there it is, Yosemite Valley. Granite walls rising 3,000 feet straight up, waterfalls dropping half a mile into mist. Beauty so intense it physically hurts to witness, Walker reportedly cried. Grown man, hardened mountain man, veteran of 100 life-or-death situations, weeping at the sight of a valley. That tells you something about the emotional landscape these men are inhabiting. And then there's Black Harris, spinning tales at rendezvous that become legendary, petrified forests where the birds sing petrified songs, stones that float and trees that grow downward, rivers that flow uphill, and canyons so deep they lead to hell. Now, Harris is lying through his teeth, mostly. But here's what's fascinating. Some of his lies hold more truth than facts. The petrified forest at Yellowstone is real. The geysers and hot springs sound like lies but aren't. When you're describing territory this strange and new, how do you separate truth from exaggeration? How does an audience back east, sitting in Street Louis or New York, evaluate a claim about boiling mud and water shooting 200 feet into the air? It sounds like a tall tale. It happens to be true. The rendezvous of 1832 at Pierre's Hole is the biggest yet. 500 mountain men, 3,000 Native Americans from a dozen different tribes, and trade goods worth $200,000 in 1832 money. To put that in perspective, that's about $6 million today. All of it concentrated in one mountain valley for 2 or 3 weeks of trading, drinking, fighting, and storytelling that makes modern music festivals look tame. Kit Carson kills a bully named Shunar at this rendezvous in a duel that makes him legendary before he's 23 years old. The way the story gets told, retold, and exaggerated, Shunar is a French-Canadian trapper who's been bullying American trappers, challenging them to duels and humiliating them when they back down. Carson, who's maybe 5'4" and 140 pounds soaking wet, steps up. They fight on horseback with rifles at close range. 1 shot each. Carson hits. Shunar misses. It's over in seconds, but the story spreads through the mountains like wildfire. Little Kit Carson, baby-faced and quiet, kills a man twice his size in single combat and doesn't blink. The legend is born. Tom Fitzpatrick earns his nickname Broken Hand. Fitzpatrick when a rifle barrel explodes in his grip, mangling his left hand permanently, but the injury makes him famous rather than diminishing him. A broken hand proves you're a Hyvernaut, someone who's wintered in the mountains and survived. It's a badge of honor. Fitzpatrick becomes one of the most respected men in the mountains, eventually guiding government expeditions and negotiating treaties. His mangled hand, a constant reminder of mountain credentials that can't be faked. The competition between fur companies gets vicious. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company and the American Fur Company are fighting for supremacy, with business tactics that include undercutting prices, stealing trappers, spreading rumors, and occasionally actual violence. Meanwhile, the British Hudson's Bay Company is employing a strategy so ruthless it takes your breath away. They're creating a fur desert in Oregon Territory, deliberately trapping out every single beaver to make the area economically worthless to American competitors. They're destroying the resource to prevent Americans from having it. It's economic warfare through ecological destruction. Native alliances are becoming incredibly complex during this period. Crow warriors regularly ride with American trappers on expeditions against their Blackfoot enemies. The Crow get access to guns and trade goods. The Americans get military allies who know the country and can fight. Flathead bands provide wives who become more than just companions. They're cultural translators, political advisors, teachers of survival skills that take years to learn. A mountain man married to a Flathead woman has access to her entire kinship network. When he needs horses, information, shelter in winter, military backup, her family provides it. The marriage isn't separate from the business relationship. It is the business relationship. Mountain men are developing technology specifically adapted to their needs. The Hawken rifle becomes the weapon of choice, MIS, .54 caliber, accurate to 200 yards, heavy enough that the recoil is brutal but the stopping power is legendary. You can drop a charging grizzly bear at 100 yards with a Hawken if you stay calm and make the shot. You can kill an enemy warrior before he can close distance with a lance or bow. The rifle becomes an extension of the man carrying it. They're developing trail markers only they can read, piles of stones in specific patterns, blazes on trees, cache systems where they bury supplies and mark the locations in ways that mean nothing to anyone who doesn't know the code. They're making pemmican, dried buffalo meat mixed with berries and fat, that concentrates a month's worth of nutrition into a parfleche bag you can carry on your back. They're learning which plants cure dysentery, which prevent scurvy, which can be used as painkillers or hallucinogens or poisons for arrows. Edward Rose and James Beckworth, Phi, both black men, become chiefs among the Crow, finding freedom and respect impossible in white America. Rose speaks multiple native languages and is reportedly one of the best fighters in the mountains. Beckworth marries into the Crow and eventually becomes a war chief, leading raids against enemy tribes, accumulating horses and wives and respect according to Crow customs rather than American racial codes. These men aren't just escaping racism. They're not finding cultures that judge them by courage and skill rather than skin color. It's imperfect freedom, still constrained by the violence of frontier life, but it's more freedom than America offers them. The daily reality of mountain man life during this golden age is harsh beyond modern comprehension. You're checking trap lines in water so cold your hands go numb in seconds. You're skinning beaver with frozen fingers that don't quite work right. You're living on meat, just meat, for months at a time, your body screaming for vegetables and fruits you won't see until the next rendezvous. You're sleeping under buffalo robes at temperatures 40 below zero. You're scanning every tree line for Blackfoot warriors who consider killing you achievement worth celebrating. You're walking miles every day carrying 60 pounds of traps and furs and supplies. But here's the thing that makes it worth it for these men. The freedom is real. Nobody is telling you when to wake up or what to do or how to live. If you want to spend a week sitting by a stream just watching eagles hunt, you can do that. If you want to travel 200 miles to see a rumored canyon or mountain or valley, nothing stops you. If you want to take a native wife and learn her language and live in her village for a winter, that's your choice. The dangers are immense, but the agency is absolute. You're succeeding or failing based on your own decisions. The Rendezvous of 1834 draws over 500 mountain men and is possibly the most successful gathering of the era. Fur prices are still high. The beaver are diminishing but still present in numbers that feel sustainable. The trade goods are flowing. Young men are still arriving from the east, drawn by tales of adventure and wealth. Everything looks healthy on the surface, but underneath, cracks are forming that will soon become chasms. Beaver populations in the most accessible streams are crashing. Areas that produced 200 pelts 5 years ago are now producing 20. Mountain men are having to travel further and work harder for the same returns. And in London and Paris, silk hats are becoming fashionable. The beaver felt hat that's driven this entire economy for decades is starting to look old-fashioned. Nobody in the mountains knows this yet. The fur companies know but aren't saying anything because they're trying to squeeze out every last dollar before the collapse. Native populations are about to face catastrophe. The steamboat carrying smallpox up the Missouri hasn't launched yet, but it will soon. The disease that will kill 150,000 Native Americans in 3 years is coming like a bomb with a slow fuse. And when it detonates, it will destroy not just native lives but the entire social structure that makes the fur trade possible. Jim Bridger is 30 years old in 1834. He's at the absolute peak of his skills and fame. He knows every major pass through the Rockies. He speaks multiple native languages fluently. He's survived encounters with grizzlies, Blackfoot warriors, avalanches, and winters that killed hardened men. He's wealthy by mountain man standards, which means he breaks even most years and occasionally makes actual money. He has a native wife he genuinely loves and children who speak English and Flathead. His world feels solid. It's all about to burn. The empire of the High Lonesome is entering its final years, and nobody sees it coming until it's too late to stop. The paradise that called them home is about to become the graveyard of everything they've built. The apocalypse arrives on a steamboat in 1835. The street, Peters, pushing up the Missouri River with supplies and trade goods and passengers, carrying something far more deadly than any cargo the crew knows about, smallpox. One infected person. That's all it takes. One person with a disease that Native Americans have no immunity to, spreading it to tribes that have no concept of quarantine or germ theory, no vaccines, no treatments that work. Within 3 years, 150,000 Native Americans are dead. Let me repeat that number because I don't want you to gloss over it. 150,000 people, not soldiers killed in battle, not elderly people dying of old age, entire families, entire villages. The Mandan nation, which numbered thousands, is effectively erased. Maybe 100 Mandan survive total. Their villages become graveyards. Their lodges stand empty with bodies rotting inside because there aren't enough living people to bury the dead. Mountain men watch their wives die in agony, covered in pustules, burning with fever, begging for death. Their children, those mixed-blood children who were supposed to bridge both cultures, died just as easily as full-blood native kids. The kinship networks that took decades to build dissolve in months. A Flathead wife who taught you her language and her people's customs dies screaming, and her family blames you because the disease came with white people. You're not welcome at her village anymore. The alliances that made survival possible vanish. Some mountain men lose their minds from grief. Bill Sublette, one of the most successful trappers of the era, starts drinking himself toward oblivion. He's always been a hard drinker. All mountain men are. But this is different. This is drinking to forget. Drinking to die slowly instead of eating a bullet. Others throw themselves into increasingly dangerous expeditions, basically courting death because everyone they loved is gone and living feels pointless. Joe Meek, who had a native wife and children he adored, becomes reckless in ways that terrify even other mountain men. The 1837 battle at Pierre's Hole happens in this context of disease and despair. Mountain men and their Flathead and Nez Perce allies fight 800 Gros Ventres in what becomes the bloodiest single battle of the fur trade era. Multiple-day siege, dozens dead on both sides, acts of courage and brutality that would be remarkable in any context. But even victory tastes like ashes, because what are they fighting for anymore? The old alliances are breaking down. The diseases are killing more native people than battles ever could. And the beaver, the entire reason anyone is out here, are disappearing. Fashion changes in ways that destroy the mountain man economy overnight. Silk hats become the height of style in London and Paris. Beaver felt hats suddenly look old-fashioned, something your grandfather wore. Demand crashes, prices collapse. A beaver pelt that brought $6 in 1835 brings $2 in 1838. The economic calculation that made all the danger and hardship worthwhile evaporates. You can't make $3,000 a year when pelts are worth a third what they used to be. But here's where the story gets really dark. The American Fur Company adapts to falling fur prices by pushing alcohol. Watered whiskey traded for furs at rates that amount to theft. A native hunter might trade 50 beaver pelts, worth maybe $100, for a gallon of whiskey that cost the company 50 cents to produce. It's exploitation elevated to a business model, and it's effective. Native communities that survived smallpox find themselves devastated by alcoholism. Proud warriors become beggars for the next drink. Social structures that survived thousands of years crumble in a decade. Mountain men find themselves dealers in liquid death. Many of them hate it. They're watching their adopted communities, their wives' peoples, their own children's heritage being destroyed by alcohol they're trading. Some refuse. Others tell themselves it's not their responsibility. They're just businessmen. A few profit enormously from the suffering. It's complicated and ugly, and there are no simple heroes in this part of the story. Nature itself is rebelling against the slaughter. Beaver populations crash below replacement levels. Streams that once had dozens of beaver lodges now have none. The entire ecosystem starts collapsing in ways that won't be fully understood for decades. Beaver dams regulate water flow, prevent erosion, create wetlands that support hundreds of other species. When the beaver disappear, streams that ran year-round start going dry in summer. Erosion accelerates. The landscape itself changes. Buffalo herds begin their great dying, not yet from hide hunters, that comes later, but from ecosystem collapse. When the beaver dams fail, watersheds fail. Grass grows differently. Migration patterns shift. The buffalo herds that seemed infinite start showing signs of stress. Mountain men who've been in the Rockies for 15 years notice changes in routes, in herd sizes, in the health of individual animals. Jim Bridger discovers the Great Salt Lake is shrinking. The water level has dropped noticeably since he first found it in 1825. Streams he trapped successfully for years run dry or produce no beaver. The paradise that made him rich and free is transforming into something that resembles desert. He starts thinking about alternatives, building a fort, guiding emigrants, anything except trapping, because the trapping is dying. The Rendezvous of 1838 draws barely 120 men, down from 500 just 6 years earlier. The gathering that used to be a massive celebration feels like a wake. Men are drinking but not celebrating, trading but not joking. Everyone knows something fundamental has shifted, but nobody wants to say it out loud. The mountain man era is ending. Not next year, or in 5 years. It's ending now, right here, and they're all watching it die. Some trappers have already left the mountains, gone back to civilization with whatever money they saved. Others have died, from disease, from violence, from accidents, from winters they couldn't, to survive. The men at the 1838 rendezvous are the holdouts, the true believers, the ones who can't imagine life anywhere else. But even they're starting to make plans for futures that don't involve trapping beaver. The native tribes that survived smallpox are negotiating with the American government for treaties they don't want but need. They've lost so many people that they can't defend their territories anymore. They need reservations, government rations, peace, even if it means surrender. Mountain men who married into these tribes find themselves caught between worlds that are both dying. Their wives' peoples are being forced onto reservations. Their own profession is becoming economically impossible. The children who are supposed to bridge both cultures are growing up in a world where neither culture exists in the form it used to. Tom Fitzpatrick, Broken Hand, the legendary mountain man, is 39 years old in 1838 and starting to look for government work. Kit Carson, only 29 but already famous, is considering becoming a guide for wagon trains. Jim Bridger, 34, is planning a fort where the Oregon Trail crosses the mountains. These men are transitioning from trappers to service providers for the emigrants who are about to flood into the West. They're becoming facilitators of their own obsolescence. The paradox is brutal. Mountain men opened the West by learning from native peoples, by integrating into native societies, by creating a fusion culture that worked. Now they're being paid to guide the emigrants who will destroy the native cultures that taught them everything. They're marking trails that will carry smallpox and cholera to tribes that have survived so far. They're creating infrastructure for an invasion they made possible but never intended. Some men refuse. They go deeper into the mountains, further from civilization, looking for valleys that haven't been trapped out, streams that still have beaver, tribes that haven't been contacted by whites. It's futile. There's no way anymore. The West isn't big enough to hide in. The American government is surveying territories, establishing forts, making treaties, and breaking them. The flood of emigrants is just beginning. The 1839 winter is particularly brutal. Men who've survived 20 winters in the mountains freeze to death. Others lose fingers and toes to frostbite. Game is scarce. Beaver are almost non-existent. When spring comes, multiple trappers don't emerge from their winter camps. Their bodies are found months later, frozen or starved or killed by animals or simply dead from the accumulated damage of frontier life catching up with them all at once. Jedediah Smith is already gone by this point, i.e., killed by Comanche warriors in 1831 while trying to open new territories. He was 32. His journals and maps survive him, guiding emigrants along routes he discovered while searching for God and beaver. Hugh Glass was killed in 1833 by Arikara warriors, finally losing the luck that had kept him alive through a grisly attack and a 200-mile crawl. He was about 53. The early heroes of the mountain man era are dying or giving up, leaving behind younger men who never knew the golden years and old-timers who can't adapt. The final rendezvous is scheduled for 1840 on the Green River. Everyone knows it's the end. The fur companies announce they won't be sending supply trains anymore. The beaver market has collapsed. The traders are losing money on every rendezvous. It's over. When the men gather in July of 1840, it's not to trade. The most of them barely have any furs. It's to say goodbye to each other and to a way of life that's disappearing. Paradise is burning, and the mountain men who built their lives in the flames are burning with it. Some will survive and adapt. Others will die in the mountains they love. A few will become legends. But the empire of the High Lonesome is finished, consumed by disease and fashion, and the American hunger for expansion that the mountain men themselves helped enable. The freedom they found was real. The paradise was real. And it's all gone in less than 20 years. The final rendezvous on the Green River in 1840 doesn't end with a bang. It ends with grown men sitting around campfires, crying. Not drinking and crying, though there's plenty of that too, but sober crying. The kind of grief that comes from watching your entire world disappear and being powerless to stop it. These are men who've faced grizzly bears without flinching, who've fought Blackfoot warriors in hand-to-hand combat, who've survived winters that killed horses. And they're weeping because they know they'll never all be together like this again. Maybe 120 men show up. The fur companies barely send any trade goods because there's no profit left in the business. The few native families who come are shadows of the thousands who used to fill the valley. Disease has taken most of them. The rest are being pushed onto reservations where they'll be dependent on government rations and promises that everyone knows will be broken. The marriages between trappers and native women, the kinship networks that made everything work, are dissolving as tribes are scattered to reservations hundreds of miles apart. The Oregon Trail is already carrying 10,000 emigrants yearly through their sacred valleys. These farmers and merchants and preachers look at mountain men like they're relics from a primitive age, savage and shameful and vaguely dangerous. The emigrants need the mountain men to survive the journey, but they don't respect them. They hire them as guides and despise them as savage. The cultural contempt is obvious and painful. Jim Bridger, watching this wagon train after wagon train roll through country he explored and mapped, makes a business decision that will define his future. He builds Fort Bridger in 1842 on the Black Fork of the Green River, right where the Oregon Trail crosses. He charges emigrants $4 per wagon to rest and resupply. $4 when you've been on the trail for months and your oxen are dying and your children are sick is cheap. Bridger makes more money than he ever did trapping, and he hates every minute of it. He sits at his fort telling emigrants tall tales about petrified birds singing petrified songs, about glass mountains and geysers that shoot to the moon. Partly, he's entertaining them. Partly he's mocking them because they don't know enough about the country to distinguish his lies from truth. And partly he's selling them his memories piece by piece because memories are all he has left. The valleys he trapped are still there, but the beaver are gone. His native wives' peoples are on reservations, and these emigrants see him as a curiosity, not a pathfinder. Kit Carson becomes an Indian agent, enforcing treaties he knows are lies, moving tribes to reservations that mean slow death. Carson has a half Arapaho daughter from his first wife, who died young. That daughter watches her father sign papers that steal her mother's people's land, that force them onto reservations in Oklahoma far from their homeland, that promise food and supplies that never arrive or arrive rotten. Carson knows what he's doing. He's not stupid or innocent. He's surviving the only way he knows how, by being useful to the American government, but the cost is his soul. Tom Fitzpatrick, Broken Hand, the man who earned respect through courage and skill, ends up guiding government surveys that carve native territory into neat little boxes on maps. He's traveling with military officers and politicians who ask his advice about where tribes live, what their numbers are, how dangerous they might be. And Fitzpatrick answers honestly because that's who he is. But his honest answers enable conquest. His maps become invasion routes. His knowledge of water sources and mountain passes helps armies move against the same tribes that once welcomed him as family. Some men can't make this transition. Bill Williams goes entirely native into night, or beyond native into something else. He lives alone in the mountains, possibly practicing cannibalism, definitely losing whatever civilized veneer he once had. When other mountain men encounter Williams in the late 1840s, they're disturbed by what they see. He's not just adapted to wilderness life, he's been consumed by it. He speaks in a mix of English and native languages, and sounds that aren't language at all. He dies in 1849, killed by Utes, and nobody mourns him because he'd already died years earlier in every way that matters. John Liver-Eating Johnson begins his 20-year war against the Crow after they kill his Flathead wife in 1847. The story goes that he eats the livers of the Crow warriors he kills, maybe 300 men over 2 decades. Is it true? Probably partially. Johnson definitely wages a one-man war of revenge that becomes legendary. But the detail that always gets me is this. He's killing Crow warriors to avenge a Flathead wife. 20 years earlier, that marriage represented alliance, cultural fusion, hope for a shared future. Now it's just fuel for violence that solves nothing and saves no one. The Mexican-American War of 1846 through 1848 employs dozens of former mountain men as scouts and guides. Kit Carson, Tom Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger, they're all hired by the army at wages that make trapping look like poverty. $50 a day to guide generals through territory they know like their own backyards. And they take the money because they need it, because their families need it, because there's no other work available that pays anything close to that, but they're enabling conquest they never intended. Carson guides General Kearny through the Southwest, helping him conquer New Mexico and California from Mexico. The passes Carson shows them, the water sources, the trails. He discovered all of these while trapping beaver and running from hostile Indians. Now they're invasion routes. The geographic knowledge mountain men accumulated through years of dangerous exploration becomes the infrastructure of American imperial expansion. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brings 100,000 men to the West in a single year. 100,000. For comparison, there were maybe 3,000 mountain men total during the peak years. This flood of humanity following trails marked by Jim Bridger and Jedediah Smith and Joe Walker completely transforms California. Within 2 years, California goes from remote Mexican territory to American state. The native peoples of California, who survived Spanish colonization, are nearly exterminated by American gold seekers in what amounts to genocide. Old mountain men guide these gold seekers for $50 a day. It's excellent money. Jim Bridger can make $1,500 in a month guiding wagon trains, more than he made in most years trapping. But he's watching paradise get paved with greed and violence, and he knows he enabled it. The trails he blazed hunting beaver are now highways, carrying 100,000 men who see wilderness as something to conquer, not live within. The irony is thick enough to choke on. Mountain men came west to escape American civilization. They learned from native peoples, married into tribes, adapted themselves to wilderness rather than trying to conquer it. They created a brief, shining moment of cultural fusion where white trappers and native peoples coexisted in something resembling balance, violent and imperfect but functional. And the knowledge they gained from that coexistence became the tool that enabled American civilization to destroy the native cultures that had welcomed them. Some men try to warn the emigrants about what's coming. Bridger tells wagon train leaders that their oxen won't survive the mountain passes at certain times of year, that they need to wait or take alternate routes. Often they ignore him because he's a rough, illiterate mountain man, and they're educated farmers who believe in progress and manifest destiny. Then their oxen die exactly when and where Bridger predicted, and they come back begging for help. The relationship between mountain men and emigrants is complicated by mutual contempt. Emigrants see mountain men as savage relics who've gone native, lost civilization, become more Indian than white. Mountain men see emigrants as ignorant children playing at pioneering, utterly dependent on the very people they despise. Both views hold truth. The emigrants are building something new, but they're building it on foundations laid by men they can barely stand to acknowledge. Kit Carson's story during this period is particularly painful. He's famous now. Dime novels have made him a legend back east, describing adventures he never had in prose he couldn't read if he wanted to. The real Carson is short, quiet, illiterate, and deeply conflicted about his role in Western expansion. He's married to a Mexican woman now, living in Taos, trying to be respectable. But the government keeps hiring him because nobody knows the Southwest like Carson does. In 1863, Carson is ordered to round up the Navajo and force them onto a reservation at Bosque Redondo. The Long Walk, 8,000 Navajo people, forced to march 300 miles from their homeland to a reservation that's basically a concentration camp. Carson leads this operation. He doesn't massacre civilians or commit atrocities in the conventional sense, but he burns Navajo crops, kills their livestock, destroys their orchards, making it impossible for them to survive in their homeland. The Navajo surrender not because they're defeated militarily, but because they're starving. Carson does this wearing a Union Army uniform, rank of colonel, earning excellent wages. He does it knowing it's wrong. He does it anyway because that's his job, and he's become a man who does his job even when it destroys him. 8,000 Navajo walk 300 miles. Hundreds die along the way. The survivors are imprisoned in terrible conditions for 4 years before the government admits the policy failed and lets them return home. When Kit Carson dies in 1868, age 58, he's reportedly calling for his first wife, Wa-Nibe, the Arapaho woman who died young, whom he loved before fame and war and the betrayals that respectable life demanded. Not Josefa, the Mexican wife he married for social acceptance. Wa-Nibe, the native woman from the time when his life made sense, when the choices were clear, when he was still becoming Kit Carson, rather than living as the legend Kit Carson. Tom Fitzpatrick dies in 1854, age 55, having negotiated multiple treaties between the U.S. government and Plains tribes. Treaties he knew would be broken, but negotiated anyway because maybe, just maybe, they'd buy time for native peoples to adapt. They didn't. The treaties were broken within years, sometimes within months. Fitzpatrick's diplomatic work meant nothing except postponing inevitable conquest. John Portugee Phillips makes the impossible winter ride in December 1866 that becomes one of the last great mountain man legends. Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming is under siege by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The fort is cut off, running out of supplies, surrounded by thousands of hostile Indians. Phillips volunteers to ride 236 miles to Fort Laramie for help, through a blizzard, in temperatures 40 below zero, through territory controlled by warriors who will kill him on sight if they catch him. He makes the ride in 4 days. His horse dies under him at Fort Laramie's gates. Phillips himself nearly dies from frostbite and exhaustion. He saves Fort Phil Kearny and the people trapped there. And it means nothing in the larger context, because Fort Phil Kearny is abandoned 18 months later after the government signs a treaty with Red Cloud and the Lakota. Phillips's impossible ride, the kind of feat that would have made him legendary in the mountain man era, is a footnote, a meaningless display of courage in a war nobody wins. The last mountain men are dying poor and forgotten. Joe Meek ends up as a U.S. Marshal in Oregon, wearing a badge and enforcing laws, about as far from mountain man freedom as you can get. He lives until 1875, age 65, long enough to watch Oregon become thoroughly civilized, thoroughly boring, thoroughly safe. Everything he ran from in his youth catches up with him in old age. James Beckwourth, the Black Mountain man who became a Crow chief, ends up running a hotel in Colorado. A hotel? Beckwourth, who led Crow war parties against enemy tribes, who had multiple wives and stole hundreds of horses, who lived as free as any man in American history, dies in 1866, running a hotel and telling stories to travelers who think he's lying. He probably dies of poison administered by Crow, relatives angry that he left the tribe. The ultimate rejection. The culture that gave him freedom and status kills him for abandoning it. Jim Bridger goes blind in his 60s, sitting in Missouri telling stories to anyone who'll listen. Stories about geysers and petrified forests and grizzly bears and Indian fights and winters so cold your breath froze in midair. Children think he's a liar, spinning tall tales. Adults humor him the way you humor senile old men. Nobody believes the petrified forest is real until Yellowstone becomes a national park in 1872, and scientists confirm that yes, there's a petrified forest exactly where Bridger said it was. Bridger, D. Sin, 1881, age 77, blind and forgotten except as a name on a fort and a pass and a lake. But here's the thing, he lived long enough to watch everything he helped build crumble. The native tribes he married into are on reservations. The beaver are gone. The buffalo herds he watched darken the plains for days are nearly extinct. The wilderness he explored is mapped and surveyed and cut through with railroads and telegraph lines. The freedom he found is illegal now. You can't just wander into mountains and trap and trade and live. There are laws, property rights, treaties, territories, the skills that made mountain men legendary become curiosities. Reading animal tracks, finding water in deserts, surviving on nothing, speaking native languages, navigating by stars. These are obsolete skills in a world of maps and railroads and towns every 50 miles. The mountain men are living anachronisms, relics from an age that lasted barely 30 years, but burned so bright it scarred the American imagination permanently. And that's the tragedy at the heart of this story. These men found genuine freedom, created genuine cultural fusion, lived genuinely significant lives in the mountains. Then they became the tools of the conquest that destroyed everything they'd built. Their knowledge enabled American expansion. Their trails became invasion routes. Their marriages into tribes gave the US government diplomatic connections it exploited. They opened paradise and watched civilization burn it down. And they couldn't stop it because they were part of the fire. The ghosts dancing at sunset in 1881 aren't the native peoples, though they're there too. The ghosts are the mountain men themselves, wandering through a West that no longer has room for what they represented, telling stories nobody believes, dying poor and anonymous, while dime novels turn them into fictional heroes who never existed. The real men, the ones who actually lived in the mountains, become invisible beneath the mythology. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the truth is too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too painful for America to acknowledge. Easier to remember Jim Bridger as a heroic explorer than as a man who guided the conquest of peoples he'd married into. Easier to remember Kit Carson as a noble Indian fighter than as a conflicted man who enabled genocide while mourning his native wife. Easier to remember the mountain men as pure symbols of American freedom than as the complex, flawed, fascinating humans they actually were. The sunset is beautiful. The ghosts are dancing. And nobody's watching except the dying old men who remember when the mountains were paradise, and anything seemed possible if you were brave enough and skilled enough and willing to pay the price. The price turned out to be everything. Between 1850 and 1865, the last mountain men face a choice that isn't really a choice at all: join the civilization they fled, or die as anachronisms in a world that's moved on without asking permission. Most choose survival over principle, which means most choose to participate in the destruction of everything they once valued. It's easy to judge them for this until you imagine being 50 years old, half-blind, arthritic, from decades of mountain winters, watching your wife die of smallpox and your mixed-blood children facing a world that despises them for being half-native. Jim Bridger earns $8,000 a year from his fort by the mid-1850s. $8,000. More than he made in 30 years of trapping combined. He's charging emigrants $4 per wagon for the privilege of resting at a log fort he built in a valley he discovered. He's selling them supplies at markup prices that would make John Jacob Astor proud. And he's telling them stories, his famous tall tales about petrified birds and glass mountains and boiling rivers, partly for entertainment and partly because he's disguised geography lessons as jokes. When Bridger tells an emigrant about the time he shot an elk through a mountain made of glass, he's actually teaching them about optical illusions caused by heat shimmer and altitude. When he describes a river that flows so fast it gets hot from friction, he's describing the Firehole River in Yellowstone, where geothermal features make the water genuinely warm. His lies contain more truth than most people's facts. But the emigrants laugh at the ignorant mountain man making up stories, and Bridger takes their money and shows them the trails anyway. The government starts hiring Bridger for surveys and military expeditions. In 1857 and 1858, he guides Captain William Reynolds on the Yellowstone expedition, officially mapping territory Bridger had been wandering through for 30 years. He's selling his memories now, revealing secrets, the hidden valleys where beaver used to be thick, the mountain passes that cut weeks off travel time, the water sources that mean the difference between survival and death. Everything he learned through hard experience and native teaching becomes government property, mapped and surveyed and available to anyone with access to military archives. Bridger knows what he's doing. He's not naive. Every trail he marks, every pass he reveals, every water source he shows, government surveyors becomes infrastructure for conquest. But what's his alternative? Die poor in the mountains? Watch his children starve? He's got families to support, too. Native wives who survived the smallpox epidemics, children who need education and futures in a world that won't let them be mountain men. So he guides surveys and takes government money, and tries not to think too hard about consequences. Kit Carson's trajectory is even more painful because Carson retains a conscience throughout everything. In 1861, the Civil War starts, and Carson accepts a commission as colonel in the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry. He's fighting for the Union, which sounds noble until you realize that in the Southwest, fighting for the Union mostly means fighting native tribes who are taking advantage of the war to reclaim territory. Carson knows terrain and native tactics better than any general. His knowledge of water sources, mountain passes, seasonal migration patterns, all gained from years living with and learning from native peoples, becomes military intelligence that enables conquest. He's hunting Navajo, Apache, Comanche, using skills that Navajo and Apache and Comanche peoples taught him. The betrayal is comprehensive. The Long Walk of the Navajo in 1864 is the culmination of this betrayal. Carson commands the operation. Not a massacre. Carson doesn't slaughter civilians. What he does is methodically destroy the Navajo economic base. He burns their crops, kills their livestock, cuts down their peach orchards, some of the trees hundreds of years old. He makes it impossible for the Navajo to survive in their homeland. They surrender not because they're militarily defeated, but because they're starving. 8,000 Navajo walk 300 miles from their homeland in Arizona to Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. It's winter. Hundreds die on the march, mostly children and elderly. The survivors are imprisoned at Bosque Redondo, which is basically a concentration camp. Inadequate food, bad water, diseases spreading unchecked. The Navajo suffer there for 4 years, until even the government admits the policy failed. Carson does this while earning colonel's wages, while wearing a Union uniform, while being praised back east as a hero of Western expansion, and it destroys him. Not immediately, he doesn't fall apart or have a breakdown, but the man who emerges from the Navajo campaign is hollowed out. His health deteriorates rapidly. He starts having pain in his chest that won't go away. Friends say he seems haunted, that he doesn't laugh anymore, that something essential has died inside him. When Carson dies in 1868 at Fort Lyon, Colorado, he's 58 years old and looks 70. The story passed down is that on his deathbed he called for Wah-Nebe, his first wife, the Arapaho woman who died decades earlier. Not Josefa, his Mexican wife who was actually there and who died the same day Carson did, Wah-Nebe. The woman from before fame, before the betrayals, before he became the legend that destroyed the real man. I don't know if that story's true, but it feels true in a way that facts sometimes don't. Carson spent his last moments trying to get back to a time when his choices were simple and his conscience was clear, before he became useful to civilization, before his knowledge became a weapon against the peoples who gave him that knowledge. Tom Fitzpatrick, broken hand, works as Indian agent for the Upper Platte and Arkansas Agency from 1846 until his death in 1854. His job is negotiating treaties between the U.S. government and Plains tribes. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 is his major achievement, a comprehensive peace agreement involving multiple tribes and establishing territorial boundaries that everyone agrees to respect. The treaty is broken within 3 years. Gold is discovered in Colorado, and suddenly the territorial boundaries mean nothing. Emigrants and miners flood into territory guaranteed to native peoples by treaty. The government does nothing to stop them. Fitzpatrick watches his diplomatic work become worthless. He dies in 1854, 55 years old, knowing that everything he negotiated was a lie. But here's the complicated part. Fitzpatrick genuinely tried. He argued with government officials on behalf of native tribes. He pushed for fair treatment, adequate supplies, respect for treaty terms. He lost those arguments, but he made them. His letters to government. Superiors are passionate and angry, demanding that promises be kept, that native peoples be treated with basic dignity. It didn't matter. The government wanted land and resources, not justice. Fitzpatrick's integrity was irrelevant. Some men refused to participate in the betrayal and pay the price. Bill Williams, who went native, is killed by Utes in 1849. Whether it's revenge for some offense or just wrong place, wrong time, we don't know. But Williams dies alone in mountains that no longer have room for men like him. His body is found weeks later, half-eaten by animals, a death that would have seemed natural and appropriate in the Mountain Man era but feels tragic and pointless by 1849. Uncle Dick Wooten builds a toll road through Raton Pass in 1866 and charges emigrants 25 cents per person, 50 cents per wagon to use it. He makes decent money, not rich, but comfortable, and he sits at his toll station watching the West fill up with people who have no idea what it used to be like. He tells stories about grizzly fights and Indian battles and rendezvous celebrations, and the emigrants nod politely while thinking he's exaggerating. He dies in 1893, age 75, having outlived the era he loved by 50 years. The Pony Express briefly employs former mountain men as riders and station managers in 1860 and 1861. Men who once spent months alone in the wilderness now ride 80-mile relay routes on a schedule, carrying mail for wages, conforming to a system that's the antithesis of everything mountain man life represented. The Pony Express lasts 18 months before the transcontinental telegraph makes it obsolete. Even the brief return to adventure and danger is mechanized out of existence almost immediately. John Liver-Eating Johnson continues his private war against the Crow through the 1860s and into the 70s. The details are murky and probably exaggerated. He claims to have killed and eaten the livers of 300 Crow warriors, which is almost certainly false. But he definitely wages a sustained campaign of violence that makes him legendary and accomplishes nothing. He's trying to avenge his Flathead wife, but the revenge is pointless because she's still dead and killing Crow warriors won't bring her back. Eventually, Johnson makes peace with the Crow in 1874. The story goes that he simply got tired of killing. He ends up working as a town marshal in Red Lodge, Montana, enforcing laws and keeping peace, about as far from his previous life as imaginable. He dies in 1900, age 76, in a veteran's home in California, having outlived not just the Mountain Man era but the entire frontier period. The California Gold Rush of 1849 creates brief opportunity for mountain men as guides and suppliers. They know the trails, the water sources, the dangerous passes. 49ers pay premium wages for that knowledge. Old trappers who haven't made decent money in years suddenly have gold seekers bidding for their services. But it's selling knowledge to people who will use it to destroy the last wilderness areas. Every successful gold rush party means more people in California, more pressure on remaining native peoples, more civilization crowding out wildness. Some mountain men try gold mining themselves. Joe Meek pans for gold in Oregon and finds enough to survive but not enough to get rich. Jim Bridger stays away from the gold fields entirely, sticking with his fort and his guiding work. Kit Carson avoids the gold rush chaos, focusing on his role as Indian agent and military scout. The mountain men are generally bad at gold mining anyway, They're used to earning money through skill and courage, not luck and persistence with a pan. The Civil War from 1861 through 1865 employs dozens of former mountain men, mostly as scouts, and guides for Union forces in the West. They're too old for regular combat, but their knowledge of terrain is invaluable. Bridger, Carson, Fitzpatrick, if he'd lived, Meek, they all served the Union in various capacities. The Confederacy has almost no presence in the Rocky Mountain West, so it's not a real war out there. It's mostly Union forces dealing with native tribes and maintaining control of trails and telegraph lines. But even this service is complicated morally. They're wearing Union uniforms and fighting for national unity and against slavery, which sounds heroic. But in practice, they're enabling Western expansion and native dispossession on behalf of a government that views native peoples as obstacles to be removed. The moral clarity of fighting against slavery doesn't extend to fighting against native sovereignty. By 1865, when the Civil War ends, the Mountain Man era has been over for 25 years, but the last mountain men are still alive, still working, still trying to find roles in a civilization they never wanted to join. They're in their 50s and 60s now. Their bodies are broken from decades of hard living, arthritis from sleeping on frozen ground, lung problems from campfire smoke, old wounds that ache every winter, missing fingers and toes from frostbite, scars from knives and arrows and grisly claws. They've sold their souls for silver, sometimes literally, taken government money to guide surveys that map territory for conquest, taken wages to negotiate treaties they know will be broken, taken fees to guide emigrants through wilderness they love. Every dollar earned is a small betrayal of the life they used to live, and the peoples who made that life possible. But what choice did they have? The beaver are gone, the buffalo herds are crashing. The native tribes are on reservations or being hunted by the army. The wilderness is being surveyed and mapped and parceled into land claims. There's no place left for mountain men to be mountain men, so they become guides, scouts, fort operators, toll road managers, lawmen, all the civilized occupations they once fled from. The price of survival is participation in the destruction of everything they valued. Some pay it willingly, others pay it while hating themselves. A few refuse to pay it and die as anachronisms, but they all pay in the end, because the civilization they rejected in their youth comes back in their old age and forces them to choose between integration and death. Most choose integration. Most sell their souls for silver, for pensions, for the chance to die in beds rather than frozen in mountain passes. It's hard to blame them, but it's also hard to forgive them, because their knowledge enabled conquest, their trails became invasion routes, and their later lives undid their earlier accomplishments. Jim Bridger, sitting at his fort charging $4 per wagon, is a different man than young Jim Bridger discovering the Great Salt Lake. Kit Carson in a colonel's uniform burning Navajo orchards is a different man than young Kit Carson dueling Shunar on horseback at Rendezvous. They're the same people, but they've been transformed by time and necessity and the collapse of paradise. The silver they sold their souls for buys them survival, but it can't buy back the freedom they lost, the cultures they helped destroy, or the paradise that burned while they guided the arsonists through the mountain passes they discovered in happier times. When Jim Bridger dies in 1881 at his Missouri farm, blind and mostly forgotten, newspapers call him the last of the mountain men, even though dozens of former trappers are still alive. Old men in Montana and Wyoming and Oregon, living quietly, telling stories to grandchildren who think they're exaggerating. But Last of the Mountain Men makes a better headline than one of several dozen still surviving, so that's what gets printed. The mythology begins at the funeral and accelerates from there. Something strange starts happening in the 1880s and 90s. As the real mountain men die off, the mythological mountain men explode into American consciousness like they've been waiting for the truth to get out of the way. Buffalo Bill Cody creates his Wild West show in 1883 and makes millions selling a sanitized version of frontier life. Cody barely knew any real mountain men. He was a buffalo hunter and army scout during the decline, arriving after the Golden Age ended. But he understands something crucial. Americans want heroes who represent pure freedom, individual courage, conquest of wilderness. Mountain men fit that template perfectly if you remove the complicated parts. The Wild West show presents mountain men as noble scouts and Indian fighters, the brave white men conquering savage lands. It removes the native wives completely, erases the cultural fusion that made survival possible, ignores the ecological destruction, eliminates the fur company exploitation and alcoholism and disease. What's left is a simple story Americans can feel good about. Rugged individuals conquering wilderness through courage and skill, opening the West for civilization. Dime novels discover mountain men and go absolutely wild. Kit Carson, King of the Scouts, appears in 1869, while Carson is barely cold in his grave. The real Carson was illiterate and couldn't have read the novels making him famous. The fictional Carson is a superhero, eloquent, tall, handsome, eloquent, fighting dozens of Indians single-handedly, rescuing white women from captivity, speaking noble truths about American destiny. None of it resembles the real man, who was short, quiet, conflicted, and bilingual in Spanish, not given to speeches. Jim Bridger becomes Old Gabe in dime novels, a combination of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, spinning yarns and killing grizzlies and outsmarting Indians through frontier cunning. The real Bridger was illiterate, told stories primarily to amuse himself and mess with emigrants, and spent his last decades going blind while serving civilization. The fictional Bridger is eternally young, eternally free, eternally adventurous in ways the real man stopped being by 1840. Theodore Roosevelt publishes Hunting Trips of a Ranchman in 1885 and The Winning of the West, starting in 1889, canonizing mountain men as the ultimate Americans. Roosevelt has an agenda, I-Teen-Deef. He's promoting a version of American masculinity built on outdoor adventure, physical courage, and conquest of wilderness. Mountain men fit his template perfectly. They're self-reliant, violent when necessary, free above all else. Perfect symbols of the American character, as Roosevelt wants to define it, but Roosevelt's mountain men are incomplete. He ignores their dependence on native knowledge because that complicates the narrative of American self-reliance. He erases the native wives because interracial marriage doesn't fit his vision of racial hierarchy. He omits their ultimate failure because American heroes don't fail, they triumph. What Roosevelt creates is mythology dressed as history, persuasive, influential, and fundamentally false. The mythology spreads through American culture like a virus. Paintings by Frederick Remington and Charles Russell show mountain men as heroic figures battling Indians and grizzlies in dramatic landscapes. The paintings are gorgeous and thrilling and completely ahistorical. Real mountain men didn't look like Remington's heroic figures. They looked like rough, dirty, culturally ambiguous men who'd spent too long in harsh conditions. But Remington's version becomes the truth in American imagination. Hollywood discovers mountain men in the silent film era and never lets go. The Covered Wagon in 1923 establishes the template. Mountain men as scouts guiding innocent settlers through hostile wilderness. Kit Carson appears in 1940 with John Hall playing Carson as a tall, handsome hero. The real Carson was 5'4". Jeremiah Johnson in 1972 with Robert Redford gives us the solitary mountain man living in harmony with nature. The real Johnson was liver-eating Johnson, violently insane, possibly cannibal, definitely not someone living in harmony with anything. The Revenant in 2015 tells Hugh Glass's story with Leonardo DiCaprio crawling through snow and fighting bears in stunning cinematography. It's reasonably historically accurate compared to most mountain man movies, Glass really did crawl 200 miles after a bear attack. But the film adds a native son that Glass is avenging, giving him clear motivation and moral purpose. The real Glass was probably just too stubborn to die and too angry to quit. The revenge quest gives the story meaning that the truth lacks. Each iteration of the Mountain Man myth moves further from historical reality toward a story America needs to believe about itself. The story is this: individual men with courage and guns can conquer any wilderness. American expansion was heroic rather than tragic. Violence in service of civilization is justified and admirable. White men did it alone without help from native peoples. The wilderness was empty or hostile, never home to complex cultures worth preserving. None of this is true, but it's what Americans want to believe, so it becomes the truth through repetition. The Mountain Man myth becomes foundational to American identity, AGD, the idea that we're a nation of rugged individuals who conquered a continent through sheer determination. The myth drives an entire industry by the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Outdoor recreation is a $50 billion industry selling freedom to office workers. You can buy a Mountain Man knife for $200 that's supposedly based on historical designs, a Hawken rifle replica for $1,000. Buckskin clothing, beaver felt hats, parfleches, tomahawks, FR, all available from companies selling the fantasy of Mountain Man freedom to people living in suburbs. Modern survivalists study Mountain Man techniques obsessively. YouTube channels teach you how to make pemmican, cure buckskin, build deadfall traps, start fires with flint and steel. Survival schools offer courses in primitive skills where suburban dads pay thousands of dollars to spend a week pretending to be mountain men. The irony is thick. They're learning self-reliance and independence in organized classes with instructors and curricula. But here's what the survivalists miss. Mountain men survived through cooperation with native peoples, not isolation. They learned from native wives, native trading partners, native allies. The solitary mountain man is a myth. Real mountain men were embedded in complex social networks spanning thousands of miles. The fantasy of going into the wilderness alone and surviving through personal skill is exactly backward from the historical reality. Video games and streaming series present mountain men as solo warriors fighting Indians and bears. Red Dead Redemption, Assassin's Creed 3, the TV series Frontier, AI, all feature mountain man characters operating independently, relying on personal skill, killing enemies, and conquering wilderness. It's thrilling gameplay and entertainment. It's also completely ahistorical. But nobody cares because the myth is more compelling than the truth. The Mountain Man Rendezvous becomes an annual event for historical reenactors. Hundreds of them scattered across the West, where people dress in buckskin and shoot muzzleloaders and pretend it's 1830. There's something beautiful and sad about this. Beautiful because people are trying to connect with history, trying to experience something beyond modern comfort. Sad because what they're experiencing is mythology, not history. The real rendezvous included thousands of Native Americans, cultural mixing, economic exploitation, and social complexity that reenactments can't capture. Museums preserve Mountain Man artifacts with reverence. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming, the Jim Bridger Museum in Montana, Kit Carson's house in Taos, New Mexico. They display beaver traps and rifles and buckskin clothing like religious relics. And maybe they are religious relics for the American civil religion that worships individual freedom and conquest of wilderness. Universities offer courses on mountain men and Western expansion. Historians write books trying to recover the real history beneath the mythology. But the mythology is so deeply embedded in American culture that historical accuracy can't compete. People want the myth. They need the myth. The truth is too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too uncomfortable. Because the truth is, that mountain men were complex humans who found brief freedom through cultural fusion with native peoples, then enabled the destruction of those same peoples when they became useful to American expansion. They were both heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, free men who helped build cages. That's not a story that fits easily into American mythology about heroic individualism and justified expansion. So we simplify. We remove the native wives and children. We erase the ecological destruction. We ignore the diseases and alcohol and exploitation. We eliminate the tragic endings where old mountain men sell out the peoples who taught them survival. What's left is clean, simple, inspiring mountain men as symbols of pure American freedom, conquering wilderness through courage and skill. Yet here's the strange thing. Maybe the myth holds a truth the facts obscure. Maybe what matters isn't the historical details, but what the mountain man represents in American imagination. The dream of walking away from safety into significance, of trading comfort for glory, of living so intensely that even death becomes adventure rather than tragedy, of finding freedom so absolute it burns everything else away. For 30 years, barely a generation, 3,000 men lived that dream in the Rocky Mountains. They found beaver in streams nobody had mapped. They married women whose languages they learned. They survived winters that should have killed them and walked through valleys of beauty that hurt to witness. They created a culture that fused white and native elements into something new and functional and brilliant. And then they watched it burn because nothing that bright can last, because beaver populations crash, because fashion changes, because diseases spread, because empires expand. The historical mountain men failed. Their beaver empire collapsed in less than 20 years. Their cultural fusion was destroyed by smallpox and American expansion. Their trails became invasion routes. Their knowledge enabled conquest. Their old age was spent serving the civilization they'd fled, guiding the destruction of everything they'd valued. By every practical measure, they lost. But the mythological mountain men never fail. They live forever in American imagination as symbols of absolute freedom. They inspire millions of people to go camping, hunting, hiking, seeking some taste of wildness in lives dominated by safety and comfort and routine. When a software engineer in Seattle buys a $200 knife and goes backpacking in the Cascades, he's chasing the mountain man dream. When a corporate lawyer in Denver spends weekends learning primitive skills, she's trying to touch something the mountain men represented. The outdoor recreation industry selling mountain man fantasy is a $50 billion reminder that the dream never died, even though the reality ended in 1840. People still want what the mountain men had, or what we imagine they had: freedom from social constraints, direct confrontation with nature and death, lives measured by courage and skill rather than wealth and status, the chance to test yourself against something real and come out knowing exactly what you're made of. Modern survivalist movements are explicitly trying to recover mountain man skills and mindset. They learn to make fire without matches, to navigate without GPS, to hunt and trap and cure hides. They're usually missing the point. Real mountain men weren't isolationists. They were deeply embedded in native trade networks. But the impulse is understandable. In a world where everything is safe and regulated and mapped, where wilderness has been conquered and commodified, people hunger for experiences that feel genuinely dangerous and free. The mountain man myth influences American foreign policy and military culture. The idea that individual Americans with guns can accomplish anything, that violence in service of expansion is heroic, that we're a nation of rugged individualists rather than a complex society dependent on cooperation, these beliefs shape how America acts in the world. For better or worse, the mountain man mythology is part of American national character. It drives both our best impulses toward individual freedom and self-reliance and our worst impulses toward violence and domination. Native American communities have complicated relationships with mountain man mythology. Some view mountain men as the first wave of conquest, the advanced scouts of genocide. Others acknowledge that individual mountain men formed genuine relationships with native peoples, that some tried to protect native interests even as they enabled American expansion. The mountain men who married into tribes, who learned native languages, who advocated for native rights, they existed. But so did the mountain men who spread disease and alcohol and guided armies. The descendants of mountain men and native women, the mixed-blood children who were supposed to bridge both cultures, ended up belonging fully to neither. They lived in the spaces between, often facing discrimination from both sides. Some became important cultural intermediaries, translators, and leaders. Others struggled with identities that didn't fit neatly into white or native categories. Their stories are largely erased from mainstream mountain man mythology, which prefers to pretend these marriages and children never existed. Contemporary historians are trying to complicate the mountain man myth, to recover the historical complexity beneath the legend. Books like Jedediah Smith and the Opening of the West, or Jim Bridger, Mountain Man, attempt to present real humans rather than symbols. But they're fighting an uphill battle against 150 years of mythology that's deeply embedded in American culture. People want the legend. They need heroes who are simply heroic rather than complicated humans who succeeded and failed in complex ways. The environmental movement has a strange relationship with mountain man mythology. On one hand, mountain men represent a connection to wilderness that environmental activists value. On the other hand, mountain men were ecological destroyers who nearly exterminated beaver populations and contributed to buffalo decline. Modern environmentalists who romanticize mountain men are often ignoring the environmental damage they caused. The real mountain men weren't living in harmony with nature. They were extracting resources as fast as possible until the resources ran out. Yet perhaps there's a final truth in the mountain man legend that transcends historical accuracy. For 30 years, 3,000 men found a freedom so absolute it required everything they had. They traded safety for danger, comfort for adventure, long, boring lives for short, intense ones. They walked away from civilization's promises and found something civilization can't offer: direct confrontation with life and death, unmediated by institutions and safety nets and social hierarchies. That freedom killed most of it to them. The ones who survived long enough to grow old mostly ended up broken, poor, blind, arthritic, haunted by memories of a youth that burned too bright to last. Hugh Glass crawling 200 miles with his throat torn open, Jedediah Smith dying at 32 with Comanche arrows in his body, Kit Carson calling for his dead Arapaho wife while dying in a military fort, Jim Bridger going blind in Missouri, telling stories about petrified birds to children who think he's a liar. These are not happy endings, but maybe the endings don't matter as much as the living. For 30 years, 1810 through 1840, roughly 3,000 men lived more intensely than most humans ever live. They saw beauty that hurt to witness. They survived dangers that should have killed them. They married across cultures and created families that belonged to both worlds and neither. They mastered skills that took years to learn and required constant practice. They knew exactly what they were capable of, because they were tested every day by grizzlies and winters and hostile warriors and their own limits. When Jim Bridger tastes the Great Salt Lake and thinks he's found the ocean, he's 20 years old and has already survived things that would break most modern humans. When Kit Carson kills Shunar in a horseback duel at Rendezvous, he's 23 and has already lived more adventures than most people experience in lifetimes. When Hugh Glass crawls 200 miles to survive, he's demonstrating a toughness that borders on inhuman. These men were fully alive in ways we can barely imagine. The tragedy is that the freedom they found was temporary and unsustainable. The beaver couldn't last forever at the rates they were trapping. The native cultures couldn't survive smallpox and American expansion. The wilderness couldn't stay wild once it was mapped and trails were marked and emigrants started arriving by the thousands. Paradise burned because paradise always burns when you find it in the real world rather than accepting that it exists only in imagination. The mountain men lit a fire in American imagination that refuses to die. It burns in every person who's ever wanted to walk away from safety toward significance. In everyone who's looked at their comfortable, secure, boring life and wondered what it would be like to risk everything for something real. In everyone who's dreamed of testing themselves against mountains and winters and grizzlies and coming out knowing exactly what they're made of. That fire burns in national parks where millions go every year seeking some taste of wildness, in survival schools teaching primitive skills, in outdoor stores selling the fantasy of self-reliance, in video games and movies and novels about mountain men, in the $50 billion outdoor recreation industry, in the American belief that individuals with courage can accomplish anything. The historical mountain men failed and died and sold out and ended badly. But the mythological mountain men live forever, calling to everyone who's ever wanted to be free. Maybe that's enough. Maybe legends that inspire are more valuable than facts that complicate. Maybe what matters isn't that Jim Bridger ended up blind in Missouri, but that young Jim Bridger discovered the Great Salt Lake and lived in paradise for 20 years. Maybe Kit Carson's betrayal of the Navajo matters less than young Kit Carson dueling Shunar and becoming legendary at 23. Maybe Hugh Glass dying from Arikara arrows in 1833 matters less than Glass, crawling 200 miles and refusing to die when dying was the only logical option. The historical mountain men were human, flawed, complicated, capable of both heroism and betrayal, finding freedom and losing it, living intensely and dying badly. The mythological mountain men are symbols: pure freedom, individual courage, American character, the dream of walking away from civilization into wildness and coming back transformed. Americans need the myth more than the truth. We need to believe that freedom, that absolute, is possible, that courage and skill can overcome any obstacle, that wilderness can be conquered or at least survived, that individuals matter more than institutions, that life can be lived so intensely that even death becomes adventure. The mountain men gave us that myth, and we've kept it alive for 180 years after their empire collapsed. We'll probably keep it alive another 180 years, long after everyone who remembers the real West is gone, long after wilderness has been completely tamed or destroyed, long after the last grizzly and buffalo and beaver are extinct, because the dream refuses to die even though the reality died in 1840. Jim Bridger's petrified birds still sing their petrified songs in American imagination. Kit Carson still duels villains on horseback at Eternal Rendezvous. Hugh Glass still crawls through eternal wilderness, refusing to die, proving that toughness and will can overcome anything. Jedediah Smith still crosses the Mojave Desert searching for God and beaver. Joe Walker still discovers Yosemite and weeps at beauty too intense to bear. They're legends too wild for truth, but they're the truth America needs. The truth about flawed humans enabling conquest might be historically accurate, but it doesn't inspire anyone to test their limits or seek freedom or live intensely. The legend about heroes conquering wilderness through courage might be historically false, but it drives people to go camping and hiking and hunting, and seeking some taste of the wildness the mountain men found. In the end, the mountain men's greatest achievement wasn't trapping beaver or mapping the West or creating cultural fusion with native peoples. Their greatest achievement was lighting a fire in American imagination that still burns today, calling to everyone who's ever wanted to walk away from safety into significance, to trade comfort for glory, to live so intensely that even death becomes just another adventure in paradise. The historical mountain men died poor and forgotten. The mythological mountain men are immortal, dancing forever at sunset in mountains that exist now only in dreams and stories and the yearning hearts of everyone who's ever wanted to be free. And maybe, just maybe, that makes them the most successful Americans who ever lived. Because they didn't just live their own lives, they created a dream that millions of people still chase, a legend that still inspires, a fire that refuses to die, no matter how long paradise has been burning. The mountain men are gone, but the mountains remain, and the dream of freedom they represent will probably outlive America itself, burning eternal in the hearts of everyone who looks at wilderness and wonders what it would be like to walk away from everything and find out what you're really made of. That's the legend. Too wild for truth, too powerful to die, too important to forget. And in the space between historical fact and mythological fiction, the mountain men live forever. To hair, young, strong, free, and calling us toward mountains that no longer exist except in the paradise of our imaginations.